Emma Goldman, who was a Russian Jewish background, went to live in America, as at one stage considered the most dangerous woman in America. She added an important, just as Reclus had this important ecological side, and Kropotkin recognized the environmental side. So I think there's a very important feminist side, and she thought that the suffragette movement was really a parlour affair, because women would still remain chained on their ankles unless they had genuine freedom. And she was very much concerned about women controlling their own sexuality, and influenced by Nietzsche in seeing how there's importance of the sovereign individual, but at the same time a communist in having a voluntary form of economic communism. She went back to Russia. Kropotkin went back. They very quickly saw the way it was going, and the last, I suppose, anarchist flurry was at the Kronstadt mutiny amongst the sailors who were against the power being taken away from the Soviets, from the actual workers' councils. In the meantime, while the Russian Revolution had in many ways failed from a libertarian point of view, and then Lenin went on. Stalin. I mean, even Lenin or Trotsky ordered the soldiers to shoot the Kronstadt sailors down like partridges. But then there was continual dictatorship of the party, and Stalin emerges, oils the machines with blood and with massive forced collectivization of the land. Meantime, in Spain, I think you have the most developed anarchist movement, in that it's massive. The CNT, which is the National Confederation of Workers, numbered 1.5 million members, and they had chosen a libertarian communism, in which they said that that one should organise society through workers' councils within factories and in agrarian communes. And then in 1936 you had a popular front voted in, a broad socialist movement, and then Franco rebelled, general in the army from Morocco, and then came back to Spain, and then the Spanish Civil War. But during that period there was the anarchist movement was the most powerful, and on the Republican side. And in Andalusia and in the Levant there was 3 million people involved in setting up agrarian communes. Very experimental in many ways. People who had been really dominated by the church, by the priest and the landowner, thrown them off, and collectivizing the land. They even want to get rid of money. There were some complete equality between men and women, some becoming vegetarian, even nudism. It was a natural way of life, and then in the problem, of course, was that the fascists in Germany and Italy supported Franco with arms and even with men, whereas the France and Britain didn't provide any arms, and so the war went against the Republicans. But in Catalonia, where 70% of the industry was at the time, that they organised that through workers' councils, workers' control, and even possibly biased historians recognise actually improved production. And George Orwell and others describe how in Barcelona there was this heady atmosphere where people were treating each other in a completely new way. But then that closed down with and the communists who were being supplied by Moscow with arms, the authoritarian communists eventually fought against the anarchists, and that was really when they started fighting against each other. Then it just enabled Franco to finally succeed. And a lot of the anarchists went into exile into France and down into Latin America. So that was considered the great, until after the Second World War, that was the great flowering of anarchism. But it was the one that had failed. And so the sort of post-war historians of anarchism said, well, it was a wonderful idea, great inspiration, but as a movement it's failed, and it's moribund. But then you had this sudden, unexpected, perhaps just as unexpected today as we see people taking to the streets in the Middle East, all these dictatorships and autocracies. But suddenly, in the late 50s and 60s, you had this sudden revival of interest in anarchism and anarchist ways of doing things. Both within the new, there's influence, libertarian influence in the new left, who rejected the communist authoritarian way, stress on workers' control, on decentralization of power, and participatory democracy. And then you had the counterculture movement, stressing individuality and solid communality, the whole communes movement. And also I think there's a new element which I consider very important, is on the importance of play and the imagination. And then in 1968 in Paris and later throughout France, you had the students beginning this uprising, influenced by situationists who thought, you know, in this situation we have to try and create something here and now, not in some imaginary future as a lot of the early anarchists thought, and calling for all power to the imagination, and slogans such as "forbidden to forbid," and below the cobbles, the beach. So that was that sort of, and that impacted me as well, because I can remember listening all night on my little radio to what was going on in Paris in 1968. So it did seem a time where you know, particularly the youth could transform the world, and I think people of my generation who were involved, that touched them. It had a very, very profound influence. But I think then the new left rather lost its way, and then they abandoned any hope of transformation and went to, I suppose, what they called the long march of the institutions. Economies in the West became much tighter. There wasn't so much loose social way of living, but there was that sort of new wave of anarchism, and that carried on. It developed in the 60s, but carried on in the 70s and the 80s within the Green movement and within the peace movement and the feminist movement, who were all interested in organising themselves in a non-hierarchical way, and wanted to work through consensus as much as possible. The communes movement, I myself was involved in the late 70s in setting up a commune in the country, based on consensus as well, and the voluntary principle, and living close to the land. And people, you know, growing awareness of the environmental crisis, that became part of new sort of green anarchism.